What is a man's life worth when he dares defy a king? That unspoken question echoed across Edward I's realm in 1305. For William Wallace, known as Wilhelmus le Walis in official English records, the answer was not negotiation, but destruction. Wallace rose to prominence during Scotland's uprising against English rule. On September 11, 1297, at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, he and Andrew Moray achieved a landmark victory. But it was no reckless charge. Wallace and Moray held back until half the English army had crossed the narrow bridge, then launched a devastating assault, trapping their enemy between the river and rising ground. The tactical brilliance turned terrain into a weapon. Moray, however, died shortly after from wounds sustained in battle, leaving Wallace as sole guardian of Scotland. The triumph was brief. In July 1298, Edward I personally led an army to face Wallace at the Battle of Falkirk. There, Wallace's forces collapsed, not from miscalculation alone, but because Scottish cavalry deserted, and English longbowmen tore through the tightly packed schiltrons of Scottish infantry. It was a tactical disaster, not merely a matter of being outmaneuvered. After Falkirk, Wallace resigned as guardian. Rather than turning to guerrilla warfare in the Highlands, he embarked on a diplomatic mission to France, around the years 1299 to 1303, seeking international support for Scotland's cause. By 1305, Wallace returned, still a symbol of resistance. But betrayal awaited him. Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight, loyal to Edward, captured Wallace near Glasgow. English accounts describe it as treachery. He was taken to London in chains. There would be no justice. No mercy in the court, Wallace's trial and imprisonment. Dragged through the crowded streets of London on August 23, 1305, William Wallace, filthy, chained, and worn by years of warfare and exile, was brought before the royal court at Westminster Hall. The space, vast and echoing with the murmur of nobles and judges, had witnessed many trials. But this was not justice. This was condemnation. Wallace was charged with treason against King Edward I, as well as robbery, murder, and inciting war. But Wallace refused to acknowledge the charge of treason. His words, though not preserved verbatim in the records, are paraphrased in multiple near-contemporary chronicles, including those of Walter of Hemingberg, who recorded that Wallace declared he had never sworn allegiance to Edward and therefore could not be a traitor. To the English, this was irrelevant. Treason was not a matter of oaths, but of defiance. Edward I, the Plantagenet monarch who saw Scotland as a rebellious territory, had no patience for legal niceties. The trial, if it can be called that, lasted only a brief time. There were no advocates for the defense, no witnesses, and no appeals. The sentence was predetermined. He was condemned to the severe and symbolic punishment used for high treason in medieval England, a sentence designed to humiliate and destroy both body and legacy. This gruesome sequence was not just a form of execution, it was a deliberate statement of power. The court sought not only to end Wallace's life, but to extinguish his legacy through punishment designed to leave a lasting message. Wallace was then imprisoned in the Tower of London, where he awaited his execution. The Tower at that time was already a grim symbol of royal authority. Held in chains, likely in the Salt Tower or a similar chamber reserved for political prisoners, Wallace endured hours of humiliation and likely abuse. Food would have been minimal. Cleanliness, non-existent. No record remains of his final words or thoughts. Chroniclers do not describe any confession or conversion. What is known is that he faced his final days without any show of remorse. To the last, he saw himself not as a criminal, but as a man who had fought for his country's freedom. His sentence was not simply to end a man's life, it was meant to erase his legacy. But what followed would only burn his name deeper into the memory of a nation. Executed in agony, the brutal death of William Wallace. At dawn on August 23, 1305, the streets of London stirred for a public execution unlike any other. This was not merely punishment, it was theater. William Wallace, the most defiant enemy Edward I had faced in the Scottish Wars, was to die in the most agonizing and dishonorable way English law could devise. The method was no secret. It was a legal sentence reserved for men found guilty of high treason, hanging, drawing, and quartering. Wallace was first stripped and tied to a hurdle, a crude wooden frame, then dragged by horse from the Tower of London to Smithfield. This journey of nearly 2 miles was brutal by design. Spectators jeered. Children threw refuse. He was battered by the road, exposed to the filth and indignity that marked a traitor's final procession. By midday, Wallace reached Smithfield. Then a field outside the city walls known for executions and public punishments. A scaffold had been prepared. Ropes, hooks, and knives were ready. There would be no swift death. The sentence was carried out exactly as written in royal decree. First, Wallace was hanged by the neck, not until death, but until he hovered on the edge of unconsciousness. His body convulsed as air was cut off. But he was cut down before death could claim him. The executioner's goal was not efficiency, it was spectacle. Next came a phase of the punishment intended to inflict maximum suffering. According to English chroniclers like Walter of Gisborough, Wallace endured one of the harshest penalties under English law, his agony drawn out deliberately, forcing him to remain aware of what was being done to him. Only then was he beheaded, finally released from his suffering. But even in death, Wallace's body was not granted peace. His remains were divided and sent across the kingdom as a warning to others. The purpose was unmistakable, to crush not only Wallace, but the very idea of Scottish rebellion. Even centuries later, the calculated severity of Wallace's execution remains a chilling example of state power used to suppress dissent. There was no mercy, no final blessing. The punishment was public, deliberate, and unforgettable, intended to deter anyone who challenged the authority of Edward I. And yet, even English chroniclers could not erase the image of his endurance. Wallace did not plead. He did not beg. His silence, or perhaps his defiant glare, endured longer than the king's decree. It was not just a man who died that day in Smithfield. It was a martyr, forged in agony. After the execution, how Wallace's remains were used as a warning. Once William Wallace was executed, the English crown ensured that death was only the beginning of his punishment. His body was transformed into a warning, an unmistakable display of power. His head, preserved and placed atop London Bridge, greeted all who entered the city. It stood not simply as a symbol of justice, but of conquest, emblematic of Edward I's desire to erase Wallace's rebellion from both land and memory. His body was divided, with each section sent to a different city in the north of England and southern Scotland, where his name continued to stir unrest. According to royal orders, these portions were placed on public display in strategic locations such as Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and most often cited, Stirling. These cities had all witnessed the flames of resistance, and now they were made to confront its physical remnants. Some traditions, particularly in places like Aberdeen, later claimed possession of Wallace's remains, with stories of secret burials surfacing over time. In Cambuskenneth Abbey, near Stirling, it was whispered that monks retrieved one of his quarters for quiet Christian interment. Whether these accounts hold fact or folklore, they speak to a legacy that defied destruction. What is certain from the Lanercost Chronicle is that Wallace was divided limb from limb and his remains disposed of in several parts of the country to strike fear in others. There was no recorded rite, no monument, no final resting place known with certainty, only fragments of bone and silence. And yet, the silence did not last. Wallace's death, and the brutal spectacle that followed, reverberated through Scotland. Rather than extinguish resistance, the Crown's cruelty deepened it. Within years, Scotland would rise again, not forgetting Wallace, but invoking him. Though scattered in life's final hour, his memory resisted conquest. The axe tried to erase, the people saved. Wallace's suffering revealed how empires use fear as a tool to control resistance, yet even in defeat, his broken body gave rise to a story that lasted longer than chains. His death changed loyalties, inspired Bruce, and reminds us that no force can truly silence an idea. His memory invites us to think, how far should conscience bend before authority? And can the price of freedom ever truly be too high? Think about this. Which moment, capture, judgment, or punishment best shows the thinking of power today? Share your thoughts below. It is in truth for freedom alone, which no man of worth gives up but with his life.